Good morning, everybody. The purpose of this video is to continue into topic 5.8, which is about the military conflict in the Civil War. This one's a little bit different, though. We're not going to be on the battle lines of what's going on. This is more about the economic and social mobilization that is going on both behind the lines of combat in the Union and in the Confederacy. So, what is wartime mobilization, you might ask? It is the idea that there needs to be some development and change in the economy and in the social structure of the country in order to help the war effort. So this is not a military conflict so far as troops moving on a battlefield, but this is all happening for some level of a military purpose. So starting with the Union here on the left side of the screen, we can start by taking a look at the Western Territories. We talked about this just really in passing when we were back in the second part of Manifest Destiny, the 1850s and 60s. We also saw this a little bit when we were talking about back in Unit 4, how transportation is going to help create some sort of national unity that is needed during the Civil War for the unity within the Union. And so we're talking about the 1862 Pacific Railway Act. This is the law that is going to fund millions of dollars to build transcontinental railroads that will extend from coast to coast across the country, kind of like a replacement bill for the railroad package in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is almost a decade old by this point, right? But this is something that is going to get paid for as part of the Union effort to make sure California and Oregon and those Western territories feel a bond with the Union as opposed to the Confederacy. There is also a promotion of Western migration with the passage of the 1862 Homestead Act. This is the one that is going to give 160 acres of free land to any farmer that goes out into west of the Mississippi to farm land. They're going to get land for free. This is kind of a big deal during the Civil War because there's a loss of farmland that's gone into the secession of the southern states, and so this is an effort to try to increase crop production in the Union by incentivizing people to want to go out there and farm more land. So really some economic and some social incentives associated with the wartime effort. To try to get more people into the military, there is like the oncoming of the draft. First, military draft in U.S. history is going to be here during the Civil War. The volunteer army was the original idea with this. The first round of volunteers signed up for 90 days. The second round of volunteers are signing up for up to 3 years. But by the time you get into the middle of 1863, it is looking like those volunteers may not be able to stick around through the duration of how long the entire war is going to go. So in 1863, there is the Conscription Act. Conscription is just a term that means the draft, that all eligible men of age are going to be required to participate in the draft, and this is going to be something that is going to help increase the size of the Union Army throughout the entire remainder of the war. There are issues with this, though. There are ways that you can get exemptions on this. The easiest way you could get exemption would be by spending $300 of your money. All you really had to do was spend $300 cash and find a replacement for your service, and you could buy your way out of being drafted. Now, $300 is a lot of money in today's world, but in 1863, $300 was a huge sum of money. The equivalent in today's dollars would be almost $7,000. So as you might figure out, this means that if you have money, if you were from a family with wealth, you could buy your way out of the draft. But if you didn't have that kind of cash laying around, you were going to be drafted. And there was no way you were going to get that exemption. So this is going to get the reputation of being a working man's army, that there is really a sense that laboring Northerners are going to be disproportionately represented in the Army. And that is of a concern in 1863 and is going to cause some tension because those for the most part, factory workers, some of them Irish immigrant factory workers, are going to bristle at the notion by 1863 that they are fighting in an army to emancipate slaves in the South because they do not see a personal vested interest in this. So this is going to lead directly to the New York City draft riots, where there are going to be weeks of rioting that goes on in New York City, where there are going to be millions of dollars of damage done in wealthy neighborhoods around the city. These are in terms of like dollars, excuse me, these are the costliest riots in American history. So this is kind of like, this is no small problem. But by the time you get after the summer of 1863, things seem to calm down a little bit because the tide in the war is starting to turn. The turning points after Vicksburg and Gettysburg, that is calming down by the fall of 1863, and so this kind of calms itself. On the Confederate side of things, they have their own conscription act. Their conscription act was a little bit earlier than the Union's conscription act. The 1862 Confederate Conscription Act included their own exemptions. These exemptions weren't cash exemptions, but if you were a plantation owner over I think the number is like if you owned a couple of hundred acres, you could get a family exemption for yourself for your plantation. This was done more so because they felt like there needed to be some supervision over the enslaved workers on these cotton plantations in the South. And that is really, about like maintaining a social stability in the South. When it comes down to the exemption policy still in the South, again, just like in the North, wealthier Confederates are going to have a way to have an exemption to get out of military service, which is going to cause at least some controversy in the South. This is also going to lead to late in the war, like the implementation of using enslaved soldiers to fight for the Confederacy. Some of this is done through maybe some ill-conceived promises of freedom after the war is over. There's also some fear tactics that go into play on this, that while enslaved African Americans, it may be illogical for them to want to fight for the support of the Confederacy, but knowledge about how Northerners would treat them was very uncertain. At best, it was uncertain, and at worst, it was some outright fraudulent lies that were told to enslaved African Americans, and so that means that there was maybe a little bit of a manipulation and encouragement to fight for the Confederates. One thing is certain, that when it comes down to the scope of the war, both sides, as the war drags on, are struggling to maintain the size of their army to, well, achieve their ultimate, goal of wartime victory. On the economic side of mobilization, the union is going to push forward with several pieces of legislation that are going to, well, raise money for the war effort. They want to avoid war debts. We've learned that lesson before, right? So here's what they try to do to combat this. They put on the Morrill Tariff Act. This is a tax on imported goods. This tax is a protective tax of sorts to try to protect American industry, but even more so than that, this is a tax to try to raise revenue to pay for the war effort. This tax is higher in rates than even the Tariff of Abominations back from the late 1820s and early 1830s. This is going to kind of begin a trend of raising revenue for the federal government through tariffs that we're going to see well into the, throughout the 19th and going into the early part of the 20th century. There's also going to be for the first time ever in American history, an income tax, a tax that all Americans are going to pay based on the amount of income that they make. This is a temporary income tax because when the war comes to a conclusion, this tax is going to be challenged in the courts, and it's actually going to be declared unconstitutional as a deprivation of your right to acquire wealth, as in property, without there being like a justification due process of law. So we'll have to come back and talk about income taxes again a little bit later on in the spring semester, but this is another way that they are trying to raise money, because if governments are going to make money, they're going to make money through taxation. Second way governments can make money is by literally making money. This is through the development of greenbacks. I think the front of the dollar bill kind of flashed by there for you, but they were called greenbacks because of the green ink used on the back end of it. This is the first ever currency in the United States, national currency. It's not the first ever national currency, but it's the first one that is not really backed by anything other than the credit of the federal government. It's not really tied directly to gold or silver or anything like that. So this is the origin of the modern dollar bill. And again, I'm going to say this a few times in here. In the spring semester, we'll talk about like the future of currency in the United States and how that's going to relate to the growth of the U.S. economy. So governments can make money through taxes. They can literally print more money, and they can borrow money. That's war debt. The other term that you can use to talk about war debts are the purchase or the sale of war bonds. If you buy a war bond, you are literally giving money to the United States government, and they are going to pay you back later on with interest. That is a loan that the government is going to pay back to the people, so that is a government debt that is owed to the people of the United States. Okay, so this is going to create some national debt, but they're going to try to mitigate it with these other kind of taxes and the use of greenbacks. And so, well, to try to regulate all this, there's going to be the institution of the national banking system. This is not a Bank of the United States, but it's a network of banks to try to make sure there's going to be consistent currency everywhere throughout the country. All of these are going to play a role in the future economic development of the country, so we will see these issues again pop up when we get to Unit 6 and beyond. Meanwhile, in the Confederacy, they've got issues with this. So issue one is that so far as like raising money to pay for their war effort is going to be through the sale of bonds. This is going to be an element of war debt that's going to come out of this for the Confederate States. When it comes down to, well, taxes across the South, you might remember that Southern states didn't really care for the idea of national taxes. They wanted no real part of a tariff. So there are no tariffs that are coming in because that was just going to raise prices a little bit more. Income taxes, not really that much of a thing as an idea in the South because that would tax the elite plantation owning leadership, and that's not really a thing that's going to happen. Property taxes occurred on a local and statewide basis, but that's really, very minimal in size. And so the reason that I've got taxes with a question mark is because taxation is not really going to be a big thing to make money for the Confederates. Remember, they identify like they are the colonists during the American Revolution, and so there's a pretty serious anti-tax sentiment across the South. So if you can't make enough money by borrowing it through the sale of bonds, and you can't make money by raising taxes, the other way you make money is you just make money. The Confederate dollars are going to be printed a lot. And when I say a lot, I mean a lot. And so this is one of those where, we will talk about inflation as we go through this, but as you print more money, the price of goods is just going to go up because there is just more money available in circulation. So prices go up. As prices go up, that has caused inflation. Well, the amount of money that's being printed in here, we are talking about the concept of runaway inflation. This is where you get to the point where inflation is going to get higher, and to help pay for the increase of prices, goods are just going to cost more. And so if you're going to do that, the way you're going to get more money to pay for the higher price of goods is to print even more money, which causes even more inflation. It just kind of builds upon itself. Economic historians estimate that by the end of the Civil War, the inflation rate in the Confederacy is approaching 9,000%. This means that in 1865, if you kind of follow this on an annual basis, in 1865, things would cost 90 times more than what they would have cost in 1864. This happens really in a short-term spike in 1865. So we don't quite get the actual 90 times cost, but the cost of, the cost of goods just kind of runs away, and it basically bankrupts large sectors of the Confederacy, both in terms of their governments and in terms of their businesses and in terms of family. And the Union had the New York City draft rights in 1863, but across Confederate cities, starting in 1863, you had bread riots, which is a little bit more similar to what was happening during the French Revolution. About 75 years earlier, but these bread riots are happening because families in cities can't afford the rising cost of food, which is going to lead to a little bit of turmoil and chaos that's going on. So, look, and when we're talking about mobilization on this, we're talking about a full-fledged economic and social effort to support the goals of the war. And you see elements of this to try to make that happen. But in both the Union and in the Confederacy, you see examples of pushback against this total war mobilization effort. And all of this, whether it's the progress moving forward, the changes that are going to have impact, and positive impact, or the pushback on this is going to represent some real negative change, we're going to see this happen. The implications of this are going to roll through future generations going well into the 20th and maybe even the 21st century.